Hi everyone, welcome to our chess's second video on the Nimzovich defense, which will mainly deal with the second move d4, and after black plays d5, white recaptures, or sorry, not recapture, but captures the pawn on d5. So, in the last video on the introduction, we introduced the first few moves of the Nimzovich defense and what are the possibilities or what are the possible options or setups that white could employ against the Nimzovich. So it starts out with e4, black goes knight c6, white goes d4 to control the center, and we mentioned last time that we want him to play d4 so we can disrupt his center and create some pressure, immediate pressure on the center by going d5. After d5, just like what we mentioned in the last video, white can play e5 as well, and also knight c3. So anyways, after e takes d5, which will be mainly covered on this video, black recaptures with the queen, and look at how many pieces are already developed for black. That's what I love about the Nimzovich defense. 2 against none right now. White has one central pawn on d4, but black has a developed knight and a queen on d5. So after queen takes d5, it's obvious that we're already threatening queen takes d4 to win the pawn. Not knight takes d4, because if you take with knight takes d4, white might be able to win a piece after the move c3. It's a possibility, but actually it's less likely, because after c3 there's queen e5 check. Maybe bishop e3 would be the right move. But queen takes d4 is a safer alternative. For example, of course, the move knight c3 would force us to take on d4 and just win a pawn. Knight c3 is a very bad move if white thinks that he can get a free developing move. Moving back, after queen takes d5, white has 3 different ways of defending the pawn, and we're going to cover all of them. If, for instance, one of the sidelines, actually the main line here is knight f3, we're going to consider knight f3 as the main move. Moves like c3 or bishop e3 are the 2 other sidelines on how white can defend the pawn. We're going to cover the move excuse me, c3 first. Pretty much the consequences of playing c3 or bishop e3 are almost the same, because the themes and the patterns are easy to remember. Black can employ the same patterns and themes against c3 and bishop e3. After c3, black can continue pressuring the d4 pawn by going e5. Now, why is this a pressurizing move? Can't white just take on e5 here if black goes e5? Let's see what happens if he takes on e5. It's a very, very bad move for white to play d takes e5. Why? Because after d takes e5, white loses the castling rights. As well, you might be thinking that, oh, well, in the endgame, castling right doesn't really matter that much. But in reality, that's not the only problem, but your king is completely misplaced in the center, where both black rooks can occupy e8 and d8 to keep a very strong pressure along the files, those 2 files. Of course, black recaptures the pawn, and white has 2 options here. He can go bishop f4. Maybe bishop f4 is the best continuation, but let's see what happens if white just makes normal developing move like knight f3. Black can go and play the move bishop g4, another free developing move. Why? Because, well, you just develop, and at the same time you have a threat of winning a pawn on f3, or if best case scenario, you can win an exchange as well. After he blunders with something like knight a3, you can go knight takes f3, g takes f3, and after bishop takes f3 check, you'd also be forking the king and the rook. So after knight takes e5, the best move for white is probably knight d2 or bishop e2, but to show the theme on how black is going to take advantage of the king on d1, we will just look at bishop e2. And after bishop e2, we have the very strong extra tempo developing move again by going castle queenside. Castling queenside check. Not only in normal castles, but it's also a check, which means that white is not going to be able to capture the free knight on e5. So it's not so free after all. And of course, after the check, maybe he's going to go king e1. If he goes knight d2, white is still going to be pinned. So white went king e1, and of course, maybe you're thinking that you should always keep the bishop pair. This time, I believe the knight is way stronger than the bishop, so you should capture on f3 with bishop takes f3. And the only compensation that white can get for having double pawns is by keeping the bishop pair, so he takes with the pawn. Black develops naturally towards the center. White pressures the knight in e5. Bishop goes to d6. Look at black's development. All his pieces are just completely centralized. And when all your pieces are centralized, it means that you have a lot of squares for your pieces that you can control. And when you have a lot of squares, you can perform a lot of different tactics or set up a lot of different tactics and cramp down your opponent's movements. And when your opponents cramp down, it's most likely that you're going to make a mistake or a blunder or something. So after bishop d6, white goes knight d2, and the final development move for black is rook he8. And as what you can see, black has all his pieces out, and not only out, but it is producing a lot of tremendous pressure. What pressure? Well, first of all, look at the white king. King is completely misplaced, because since the king is on e1, black has a lot of different possible tactics in this position. In fact, one of them is knight d3 check, and that would be a fork. Not only a fork, but it's combined exploitation of the fork, the pin, and at the same time there's also a discovery attack towards the bishop on f4. So this would be an ideal position for black if white captures the pawn on e5. Now, you might be wondering, well, white is not really forced to take e5, but before that, actually, I forgot to cover bishop f4. Maybe the best possible way for white to continue, because the theme was quick development, free developing move. Black can go bishop d6. And after bishop d6, white can play knight f3. The idea is if black takes on f3, white will take on d6. Take bishop instead of the knight, and exchanges would be pretty good for white. But no problem, black can just keep going with his development. No need to capture. So once again, we have a free developing move here that causes pressure and would force white excuse me, to react towards the f3 square, the f3 knight. White develops bishop e2, and wait for it. What's our thematic move here? We can play bishop takes f3. Not knight takes f3, bishop takes f3. So after he takes there, we can castle, and it's starting to look very, very common or similar to the last variation that we looked at. Except this time, white decided to place the king on c2, but it's not going to matter too much. Black has just a very, very good position with great development, better pawn structure, and more activity with his pieces. Moving back to the move e5 by black, white is not really forced to capture the pawn on e5. Therefore, another option for black, or sorry, for white, is to play knight f3, right? Why not just support the pawn on d4? It's okay to get an isolated pawn on d4, but in return, white wants to be able to get some free developing moves too with knight c3 if black captures the pawn on d4, and somehow activate his pieces, get his king into safety, and then take advantage of a possible exposed king, black exposed king in the center. But our move is we just keep pressuring him. Once again, see, Nimzovich teaches you how to keep the pressure on, how pressure is important, especially when you can get a free development out of it. So bishop g4, threatening bishop captures knight, pawn takes bishop, pawn takes pawn, pawn takes pawn, and black can go queen takes pawn, winning a pawn, and the same time we manage to destroy his pawn structure on the king side. So what's the best defense for white here? If white is not too careful, like for example, another cool tricky trick that you could learn that you can employ against your opponent with the Nimzovich is if your opponent thought that there is no way that black could or white could defend the d4 pawn, he might just end up taking here. So we can take the queen on d1 with a check. White king takes on d1, and we have a very strong move here, which is it knight takes e5? Even better. Why? Because we have, or we can set up this very cool trap. So after castle queenside, white has two obvious moves. It's king e1 or king c2. Obviously, if he goes knight d2 as well, black can just take the pawn on e5 because the king is pinned. The knight and the king are both pinned down. So white has two options. If he goes king e1, can you find a tactical shot for black here? Of course you can. The move is knight takes e5. And of course during the tournament you can add a little bit of acting, pretend you just blundered the knight, pull your hair out or something. But yeah, just knight takes e5. And the idea is if your opponent takes, can you find a mate in one? Of course you can. It's checkmate with rook d1. Alright? So instead of knight takes, okay, you might be wondering, well, white is not really forced to capture an e5. Well, no problem. After he goes bishop e2 to defend the pawn, we just basically transpose back to one of the thematic ways for black to develop and take advantage of white's weak pawn structure, king, and lack of development. Okay, so after bishop g4, the best defense for white here, believe it or not, is the indirect way of protecting the pawn on d4 by going bishop e2. Now, the idea of bishop e2 is, do you think black can win a pawn here? For example, if black goes e takes d4, white goes c takes d4, can black take on f3, the knight, to remove the defender and win the pawn on d4? Okay, I'll give you 1 second to calculate. Oh, time's up. Black goes bishop takes f3. That's a double no. Why? Because after bishop takes f3, queen takes d4. Unfortunately for black, white can capture the knight on c6. Oh, no problem. Queen can capture oh, no, you're under check. Which means, since you're under check, you have to capture the bishop back, and your queen is left undefended after queen takes d4. Okay. Unfortunately for black, you're not going to be able to win a pawn at the moment, but we don't have to worry about that. All we have to do is to play the move e4. Just e4. So what's the idea? Gain more space, free space in the center basically. So he has to move back with knight d2, and you can capture the bishop on e2. Queen takes e2, and we can overprotect the pawn on f5. That means, look at that, we have the 4 against 3 majority on the king side, which means if we can advance our pawns and make our pawn chain longer on the a8 to h1 diagonal, that means we can produce a very effective and strong attack against the white king. White goes knight c4, black castles queenside. So the general rule is, when you're attacking, you have to make sure that your king is completely safe. White castles, get your king safe. Some variations. So of course, white has to counterattack, just to make it, just to show that we're not trying to be biased here in the video. Of course, that's that bishop b2 move is a little bit weird, but basically he wants to start expanding on the queen side. And also, you might be wondering why g3 is played. Of course, white wants to prevent black from jumping to f4, which can produce a lot of pressure towards the g2 pawn, since the queen is also probably intersecting towards the g2 pawn if you push the pawn to e3. black just keeps developing, and black has a very nice position. This queen happens to be also a protector towards white's attack, because if he tries to expand with b5, the queen can easily capture the pawn on b5. So our next plan is definitely to keep expanding with f4, h5, h4, h3. And okay, so that's what's gonna happen if white plays the best move or best moves after the move or the defense with c3. And of course, c3 is only a sideline. Now, just like what I was mentioning before, both c3 and bishop e3, the themes are going to be quite similar. I'm just going to show you real quick on what could possibly happen if he tries to play bishop e3. After bishop e3, what's our magical move? We can still play the move e5. And you might be wondering, how is this connected? Well, if he takes, you can go queen takes d1 check, takes, knight takes there, and after knight f3 or f3, not allow you from pinning the knight on f3, you can just develop the bishop on f5. And now it's our thematic move here. We could castle, put the king into an awkward position or situation. Whoops. Okay. Alright, so he wants to play bishop e2, knight f6, maybe king c1, get out of the way, and then we can just take out all our pieces, and the last piece that's coming in is the choo-choo train rook h e8, with a lot of pressure towards e and d file. So, what else? How else can white differ from the move c3? Alright. Bishop e3, e5. Maybe he can play the move knight f3. But after knight f3, what's our magical thematical move? We can play bishop g4. And after bishop g4, maybe c3. Oh! That's absolutely bad. Okay, so you can't do that. So bishop g4 with the idea of castling queenside. Knight f6. Lots of pressure in the position. Therefore, both c3 and bishop e3 are not very good. And of course, we're going to look at the main line now, which is knight f3. After knight f3, believe it or not, we can still play the very good move e5. And you might be wondering if it can transpose to the thematic or thematical moves that or themes that we've seen so far. Of course it can. For example, if white captures on e5, black can take on d1 check. King takes d1. What's our thematic move? Bishop g4. Now this time you might be worried that you're not able to recapture the pawn on e5 immediately, but excuse me, it's not really a big deal, because after bishop g4, for example, if he was really greedy about the pawn with bishop f4, otherwise we take the pawn on e5, or we can castle with a check, take the knight on f3 and take the pawn on e5. So he wants to keep the pawn, but we don't care. We care about quick development, because we believe that if we develop quickly, we can take out all our pieces and produce pressure and eventually get the pawn or material back that we lost from before. Okay, and now the next idea for black is knight e7, king c1, more pressure, knight g6. And if your opponent's not too careful, like a crazy move like a3, you can just play rook h8 and regain the pawn back. So that's all you have to know about the not very good second move, or not really the second move, but the third move, e takes d5. And most likely your opponent's going to think that, you know, taking out your queens early in the game is bad, but I guess it's not so bad. So that's why chess is such a great game. You know, you can't really enforce a certain rule and you know, just tell your opponent that, oh, you can't do that, because that is against the principles. But it's not really against principles if you have, or if you know what exactly you're supposed to do. As long as you have a plan in chess, you're going to be fine. Well, thanks for tuning in and watching my video. Hope you enjoyed the first part of the Nimzovich. See you guys again soon. Have a nice day.